I'm Carmine Gallo. Today I'm talking to Art Markman, a professor of psychology and marketing at UT Austin. He's a popular podcaster and author of Bring Your Brain to Work, one of my favorites. It's got a permanent spot on my bookshelf. Hello, Art.
Hey, Carmine, it's great to be here today. Thanks so much.
Love the subtitle, Using Cognitive Science to Get a Job, Do It Well, and Advance Your Career. Says it all.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? I mean, so few people know much about the way their mind works, and so we're asked to think for a living, and yet we don't really have those operating principles. So I feel like the more you know, the more that you can control what you're doing.
And your background is, when you say a psychologist, with a specialty in what? Is it cognitive science or neuroscience?
Cognitive science. So I have a background with some computational work, some certainly behavioral psychology, doing studies, but I also bring in some neuroscience, some philosophy, some linguistics. So I draw pretty widely. The idea behind cognitive science is that there's no particular approach to studying anything complicated like the mind that is going to tell you everything you need to know. So the trick is to take it from a bunch of different vantage points and hope that at some point you develop some insight by looking at it from multiple different perspectives.
Art, let's talk about this concept of the three brains before we get into specific and actionable tips for leaders and entrepreneurs. Tell me what you mean by the three brains, and is it something that we should understand?
Yeah, so if you begin to divide up the set of skills that you have, that particularly skills that relate to the workplace, what you find is that you can often put them into bins that help you to organize the way that you're thinking about your own thinking. And those bins are motivational, cognitive, and social. And so both as a leader, where you're trying to motivate yourself and others, you want to understand what factors it is that drive people to pursue particular goals and to achieve those goals, or sometimes to fail to achieve them. So that's that motivational brain. There's a lot of mechanisms that we have that guide social interactions. And of course, humans are a social species, and work is a deeply social process. And so understanding how we engage with each other is incredibly important. And then our ability to solve problems, to reason through things, to think about the complexity of what we're working on, really falls in the domain of that cognitive brain. And so I find it really useful to divide it up in that way. I mean, obviously your actual brain is a single mass organ, but this is a set of divisions that I find useful for really beginning to learn about some of the way that you think.
Social, motivational, and cognitive. Yeah,
That's right.
I think that's very important for leaders to understand, especially as they learn how psychology and cognitive science can help them become better leaders. So let's talk about leadership communication, specifically in a crisis. There's two areas that I want to focus on first. One is how to communicate through uncertainty, and second, motivation, both of which are topics that you've covered. First, communicating in times of uncertainty. Art, nobody knows how this is going to unfold with the coronavirus pandemic. In fact, I think this is one of the first times in my memory that so many publicly traded companies are not giving forward guidance or forecast because they simply don't know. From a cognitive science perspective, what is a leader to understand about communicating in times of uncertainty when your listeners are not only uncertain, but they're anxious, they might be depressed, they're not sure about the future? What am I as a leader to do when I'm communicating with them?
Yeah. So and that anxiety is important to understand. The thing is that if you think about it, your brain is a prediction engine. A lot of what it's trying to do is to predict what's going to happen in the future. And times of uncertainty are basically saying nothing in your past experience is allowing your brain to predict what's going to happen next. And because uncertainty can be dangerous, we end up being really vigilant about that. And that creates that anxiety. Anxiety is an emotion you experience when there's some potential crisis or calamity on the horizon and you're not sure what to do. And that's why you are vigilant the way you are when you're really anxious. So we have to understand that. Now, as a leader, part of the problem is you'd like to allay that anxiety, but you can't because in fact, the future is truly uncertain. The worst thing you can do is to fail to communicate. And the reason for that is that we will make things up in the absence of information. So, as I like to say, both nature and the gossip mill abhor a vacuum. And so, as soon as there is a lack of communication, then everyone at the organization is going to start talking, making things up that are likely to be worse than anything you could say. Now, it's fine to say to people, we don't know what's going to happen, and here are some of the options that we're considering. I think that when you can't trust in the outcomes in the future, what you have to do is to create trust in the process that you're going through. And so in many ways, what you want to do is to talk about the steps that you're taking, the 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 brain trust that you've assembled that is working on trying to create plans to move forward, and to give people a sense of what that cadence of work is that the leadership of the organization is going through in order to address the future and to be adaptive to it. And I think that if people can trust the process that you're in, that's extraordinarily helpful when the outcomes are really uncertain.
Art, that is excellent, really excellent advice. And that segues into the next topic, which is closely related, which is motivation. Now, I've written a lot of books on communication and leadership, and in my opinion, the best speakers or the best communicators are those who can paint a picture of a better world. In this current environment, given what we just talked about in terms of the future really unknowable, and it's hard to it's anyone's guess as to what the future is going to be, how do I continue to motivate my team remotely when the future is anyone's guess?
Yeah. No, it's such a great question and such a difficult time for anyone in a leadership role right now. The way that I see the notion of motivation when it comes to particularly what you could think of as motivational speaking, not in the kind of rah, we're going to hire a motivational speaker, but the kind of real motivational speaking that a leader has to do. It's all about creating what I like to call the bridgeable gap. So both elements of that are important. The gap is the difference between where we are right now and where we'd like to be. And that gap creates energy. Okay, and because it's energizing to know either that there's a desirable future that we haven't achieved yet, or that there's a potential catastrophe that if we don't do something, we're not going to avoid. That creates energy. Now, the physicists will tell us that energy without direction is heat, but energy with direction is work. And so what we want to do is to channel that energy into something productive. And that's where the bridgeable piece comes in. If you don't believe that there's anything you can do to bridge the gap between present and future, then you create heat, you create frustration, anxiety, anger. So instead, you want to help people to see a plan that will move us into the future, that bridges that gap. Now, in times of uncertainty, you can't paint a picture of some beautiful thing that's going to happen in the future because we don't know what the future is going to hold. And that's why, again, the process becomes important. Because what you want to do is to give people a sense of agency, a sense that there are things that they can do that will actually have an impact on the future. And that's why you want to give people a sense of, we don't know what's going to happen. Here are the ways that we're evaluating what the future is going to look like so that we can make mid-course corrections as we gather more data. And here are the things that we're asking you to do to help us to move forward in that way. And so the bridge is we're walking short distances. So we're not bridging the entire gap now. We're bridging, you could think of yourself as walking through an archipelago where you're just trying to get to the next stable state so that you can evaluate where to go next. It's very difficult. It requires frequent communication. It requires a lot of attention to data. And it requires listening to the concerns of the people who work for you, because you partly because you want to be able to address what their fears are, but partly because in times of uncertainty, you never know where the next important piece of data about the future is going to come from. And by listening broadly to the people in your organization, sometimes you gather insights about what's happening that you might not have gotten any other way.
Excellent advice. Art, have you thought about or have seen studies, or maybe you've done some research on the limits of what we are doing here, the limits of virtual communication? Because what we've talked about, how you have to over communicate and paint this process to give people that sense of, to alleviate the anxiety, paint that bridgeable gap. I happen to believe, especially in all my research, over the last 15 years or so, not as extensive as you, but we lose something. We actually lose a lot in communication when we are not in person. What challenges or hurdles does this process create that leaders should consider?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. A lot of the research on communication points out that in some sense we evolved to communicate in a very specific environment in which a small number of people communicate face to face in real time. And the further away you get from that, the harder it is to communicate. And so now we're not in the same location anymore with other people. And some amount of our communication is happening not just in Zoom, but in asynchronously. So we're sending text messages and emails, and we're not actually seeing the facial expressions of other people. So the further away you get from that ideal, the harder it is to communicate effectively. And one of the things that means is that we need to end up doing a lot more one-on-one communication with key people than is necessary when we're all in the same place. I can get my brain trust together, my 5 or 6 most trusted people into a room. And if all of us are standing around talking in the same room, we're occupying the same space, we can look at each other, we can see the body language that tells us how people are feeling, we can read people's facial expressions. There's a lot of benefit that you get from that environment. When you have the Hollywood Squares format that you get or I guess for the younger generation, Brady Bunch format, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
that you get when you're on Zoom, it's very hard to pay attention to everything that people are doing. People are not making eye contact with each other.
Right.
And in those situations, it's very hard to really feel like you have been understood. And so in those situations, you have to break communication down to its most basic elements, which means that leaders have to do a lot more one-on-one communication with key people, having those conversations, making sure that people have that opportunity to express more explicitly some of the things that you might be able to pick up just from the way that they're carrying themselves, the way that they're looking at you, the way that they're just the facial expressions. A lot of that is missing. It's harder to pick up. And so you got to work a lot harder. And it's one of the reasons why anyone in a leadership role right now probably feels exhausted by the end of the day.
Yeah, after about 7 Zoom meetings from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., that's what happens.
Oh,
Hey,
heck yeah. Listen, I mean, I am one of 6, leading one of 6 work groups for the University of Texas to plan our fall semester. And since March, things have been basically just one nonstop Zoom meeting with different participants, and it really is exhausting.
Art, the fact that we're talking about this, I'm not going to ask you to do a forecast because I think most forecasts are going to turn out not to be right. However, in my opinion, just kind of based on what I know and what I understand, I think this idea that we're all going to be virtual all the time and there's going to be a major restructuring of how we conduct work and business, I don't think the extreme is going to happen. It's going to change because virtual has made it a lot easier to communicate with people around the world, and it works very well. I get it. I like it. And I'm going to use it a lot more than ever before. So it's accelerated my learning, what I do. but there'll be a hybrid, Art. We're not going full virtual all the time.
No,
That might be an unpopular forecast to make these days because everybody seems to want to believe that everything's going to change.
yeah, no, well, it's we always we overweight the current state all the time, and I think we will gradually move back to much more in-person interaction. There's a lot to be said for being physically co-present, and I think that until we master technology for creating a much more immersive virtual environment, the kind of technology we're using right now is still going to be exhausting. um, there's just something about being in a meeting and having everyone be able to look at a single person in the room as a signal that that person's supposed to speak next. That's a very natural thing to do. Um, so I do think we're gonna engage in a lot more face-to-face interaction when circumstances allow that again. Look, I think there's a lot to be said for some of these virtual interactions. Prior to the pandemic, I was generally on an airplane every 3 weeks to go places, and
Mhm.
maybe some of that travel was unnecessary.
Yeah,
But honestly, it's very hard. I think there's a lot of value in lectures and public speaking and things like that.
absolutely.
Public speaking is an absolute disaster on over these technologies. The speakers can't create any sense of rapport with an audience. You don't know if any of your jokes landed. So it's really, I think we get a lot of value out of those kinds of meetings. I've attended a couple of virtual professional conferences, and while there's information that you can transmit, it's missing all of the social interactions that are often the most important part of of business kinds of gatherings. It's
Yeah.
how you create the sense of knowing who your colleagues are, knowing who the other people in your industry are, and it's those interactions that enable people to become part of that leadership circle in an industry, and we're not going to be able to replace that, I think, with a
Art,
virtual
that is,
environment.
it's very, I'm glad we're even talking about this. And I'm certainly going to write more on this topic because it's important for leaders to consider. Your workplace does not want to go all virtual all the time. It was convenient for a few months. People are saying, hey, I can save time on my commute. Now, 6 months later, we're starting to see the challenges with it, the hurdles and the frustrations and the fatigue. So be careful when you consider the workplace of the future. Maybe it's more of a hybrid than you think. But anyway, I'm glad we talked about that.
Well, but
Hey,
I want to
yeah,
jump
go
on,
ahead.
one thing, which is, as a leader, one of the things that you have to do a lot is ask people to do stuff.
Hmm.
And there is a qualitative difference between asking people to do stuff by being able to pop your head in their office and to talk to them about it, versus emailing about it, texting about it, or even having to set up a special Zoom meeting to talk about it. It's much less natural. You come across as a leader as being much more demanding when you have to do everything virtually in this way. It's really just it's incredibly valuable to as a leader to be occupying the same space with the people that you're working with, so that you can create a sense of teamwork rather than the much more hierarchical structure that I think gets created in this virtual environment.
Art, because your book also and your work focuses on using cognitive science to get a job, and a lot of folks are doing virtual interviews now, I do want to address this before we're done. How are we to speak to career professionals who are interviewing for jobs in what I am sensing is a hyper competitive workspace now because of all the furloughs and layoffs? Now it's the power is kind of coming back to the corporations and the recruiters, and they can be a lot more selective. So in terms of standing out or standing apart from your peers on virtual, what does cognitive science say about that? Anything we can use?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to do and this has always been true, but I think it becomes particularly true in the virtual environment, is to do what's called backward design, which is to ask yourself, how do you want the people that you've just spoken to, the interviewers, the recruiters, how do you want them to be mentally different after their experience with you than they were before?
What an
And
interesting concept, backward
and
design. Okay.
and then to structure the as much of the interaction as possible to get them there, which means, what are the small number of things about you that you want them to know? What are some of your character strengths that you would like to find a way to display? And then do what you can to create opportunities within that environment to do that. So for example, if you feel like you work well by putting people at ease, think about what could you do as part of your interview to try to put everyone at ease. And it might be as simple as what you choose to use for your virtual background, or if you're
Mhm.
using an actual background, what it is you choose to put in that background. It might involve um, trying to really make sure that you ask a couple of those small talk type personal questions that give people that give an interviewer an opportunity to step out of that very professional role, right? To just look at somebody and say, you know what, this has been a really tough time. It must be hard to do this. How are you holding up? Right? Those
Yeah.
little things that give you an opportunity to display an aspect of who you are in an interview circumstance where we're much more familiar with that setting. You can often do that instinctively, particularly for folks who are a little further on in their career. We have to do a lot more work explicitly in these virtual environments. And so you have to be a little bit more mindful of the details of what you're doing in order to make that go as effectively as you want it to.
In one of your episodes of the podcast, Two Guys on Your Head, uh, you were talking about this was not about professional communication, but it was about children's stories, right? Children's fairy tales. And you mentioned something that I've written about, and that's why it caught my attention. But you said that the rule of three, memory happens in threes. As soon as I heard that, I thought to myself, that's also a really good application to communication or a job interview. Uh, don't give people the kitchen sink. Tell them three reasons they should hire you. But can you please explore that from a cognitive science perspective? What do you
Yeah,
mean by memory happens in threes, and how does that apply to leaders and job candidates in a professional setting?
yeah, it's such an important thing. It's actually, it was a centerpiece of an early book I did called Smart Thinking. And you know, one of the things if you look at the memory literature, what you find is memory happens in small numbers of things. What I like to sometimes say, three-ish. You know, if you think back to an experience you had, it might have been a book you read, a movie you watched, a lecture you attended, an interview with somebody. There are roughly three things that you will remember about that later. It might be two, it might be four, but it's not going to be 12. And so one of the things that means for you as a leader, whether you're in an interview, whether you're giving a speech, whether you're doing a welcome video, is people are going to remember three things. So you have to control what those three things are. And that means, again, from a backward design standpoint, asking, what are the three things I want people to know about me when we're done? And how do I set it up so that those are the three things that come to the forefront? Which means, you know, in part, if you think about the age-old advice for how you give a talk, which is tell people what you're going to tell them and then tell them and then tell them what you told them. What you want to do is to say, here are the three things that I want you to know. I'm going to tell you what they're going to be. I'm going to elaborate on them in the meat of my talk, and then I'm going to review them for you so that I have done as much as possible to help you to remember what it is that you're supposed to know about me or what you're supposed to know about this interaction. And of course, the problem for many people is they can't resist telling you more. And what they forget is a really critical lesson, which is that less is more.
But Art, everything we have to say is so important.
Obviously.
I want to give you all of my experience.
That's right. Well, you know, tell
Yeah.
you tomorrow, you know, tomorrow's another day for
It is,
another
but
three things.
it's hard. It is very,
Absolutely.
very hard to cut people down, condense it. I often tell executives, you have to be your best. You have to be your toughest editor.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely right. You have to be willing. And you know, the other thing is when people are evaluating you, they use an averaging model, not an additive model. So three great things plus a mediocre thing, even if it's good but it's not great, you might think, well, it's a good thing, so I told you three great things and I told you a fourth thing that's still good, that should be better for me. But actually what happens is if I tell you three great things and then one that's good but not great, it actually brings the average down.
That's very interesting. Repeat that again. So you say people use an
an,
averaging model and not
an,
a.
an additive model.
Oh,
So if it was additive, every good thing I told you would make me better in your eyes. But if I tell you three great things and then a merely good one, even though that good one is still a net positive, it brings the average down. So don't bring the average down.
Art, that is so awesome. I love talking to cognitive scientists. Over the last, say, decade, I guess, of my career, I've sort of reached the conclusion that the best degree you can get or the best major you should probably focus on if you really want to succeed is psychology, or at least minor in psychology and take some psychology classes, because neuroscience and cognitive psychology and behavioral psychology explains almost everything
Yeah,
about how you behave, how people respond to you.
yeah, I would push it a little further. I actually was the founding director of a program at the University of Texas called the Human Dimensions of Organizations. And what we did was we actually take the liberal arts really broadly. So I think psychology is great for a lot of things. I think sometimes you need the other social sciences like anthropology to understand cultural influences or sociology
Yeah.
to understand group dynamics. But
History,
actually history, yeah,
all my learning and communications come from mostly from
yeah.
history books.
Yeah. Listen, I think there's a lot to be learned from history, from philosophy, from both on the ethics front, but also on that ability to really take an argument and break it down to its core components, and even literature. That opportunity to live life through somebody else's uh, experience, and then translate that back into your own. So for us, we find that, and what's beautiful about this is the disciplines of the liberal arts have ways of talking about what people do. And until you have names for all of these concepts, it's hard to manipulate them and to really communicate them to other people.
Art, finally, let's talk about your podcast, which is an NPR show, Two Guys on Your Head. You co-host with Dr. Bob Duke, right? You're still co-hosting with
That's right.
him.
Yeah.
I've been listening for years. I love it because every show focuses on one topic about your brain and brain science. But here's something I've been dying to ask you. I don't know if this is intentional or not. Every episode is a podcast, is only 7.5 minutes or so. Why? Is there a cognitive reason for that?
I think it's one of these things where it's better to be lucky than good. It's a longer story, but the short answer is we got approached by our intrepid producer Rebecca McEnroy after doing a live event, and she asked us if we would like to do a show. And when after taping an hour-long pilot, the folks at the station said that on NPR affiliates, there's often about a 10-minute window at the top of the hour, at the bottom of the hour, basically, where the national broadcast throws it back to the local, and you can fit a 7.5 minute segment into that. They said, so why don't you try that? And very quickly we realized, no, this is actually perfect, because if you think about the variety of podcasts you listen to, even the ones you love, you almost never have enough time to listen to the whole thing in one sitting because you just don't have that much time. And a lot of times what will happen is you'll be like, all right, it's sort of like watching an NFL football game.
Mm-hmm.
ESPN can boil that entire game down into 2 minutes or 3 minutes of highlights, but you have to sit through all 3 hours of the game to get there. And I feel like a lot of podcasts are like that too. You sit through 45 minutes of of stuff when there were really a few minutes of real nuggets there. And so what we do with our show is to try to find the nuggets. And the way we do it is Bob and I get together with Rebecca. We talk for, half an hour, 40 minutes. And then Rebecca goes back and turns that into a 7.5 minute long conversation that sounds like it happened all at once, but actually she mixed and matched some things. And so you're really getting the highlights of the conversation whittled down. And I'll tell you, I don't think we would have drawn it up that way, but I wouldn't go back and do an hour-long version now for anything, because I think the 7.5 minute version is just far more effective.
I'm involved in pitch competitions and judging pitch competitions, and I also teach executive education level courses. And whenever we talk about delivering a pitch for your idea and keeping it under 10 minutes, you always get a lot of pushback. Well, how can I possibly do it in under 10 minutes? And I say, no, look, it's more about the exercise of doing it. You're going to see how powerful it is to take a 45-minute presentation and condense it to 10 minutes or less.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, right? I think it's Blaise Pascal who had the quote that said, "This letter would have been shorter, only I didn't have the time."
Good point. Yes.
And it's actually quite difficult to edit yourself down to just the essence of what it is that you're trying to say.
Hey, Art, good communication is hard.
Yes, it is. It absolutely is.
That's why there's
skill.
That's why there's so much bad communication and bad PowerPoint, because that's easy.
Oh,
what
yeah.
we're talking about is an advanced concept. It actually takes some work and thought and creativity.
And it also requires a demanding audience. One of the reasons why pitches are so important is because if you're really trying to pitch for funds, venture capitalists are ruthless. They want to know what's really in there, and so they will hold your feet to the fire. But most audiences don't. In fact, most audiences believe that if they don't understand what you were saying, it's their fault, not yours. And really, it's the opposite. If you hear a talk by someone and you don't understand something that they said, you shouldn't assume that you were too dumb to get it. You should assume that the other individual either didn't understand it enough or didn't spend enough time preparing to be able to take the complexity of what they were trying to explain and bring it to you in a way that you could get it.
Well, Art, I've got to tell you, you are just a real pleasure to talk to, because I have been studying and researching and writing about communication and leadership for 15 plus years, and I've studied it even longer than that. So it's very hard for me to find books and experts who advance the subject. It's repetitive. And yet, just in this conversation and in Bring Your Brain to Work, you have given me so much more that I didn't know before, or things that have advanced the conversation. So if you can teach me something new, a lot new, then I know that there's just real substance there. So I hope people can continue to check out your podcasts and read your books and follow you at UT Austin. Give my best to the folks at the university too for putting us in touch with each other.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate taking the time. It's always nice to talk to somebody who's got a set of common interests.
Thank you, Art.